Hitler decides to do the boldest thing yet. He invades the Soviet Union, this vast, enormous, powerful country. And he takes his troops into Russia, and eventually that begins to be the beginning of the end. But not before the United States is attacked in 1941 by Japan, who was an ally of the Germans at the time, and who was fighting against the Chinese. So Germany begins to form an alliance with Italy and with Japan, and of course by this time the U.S. begins to join the World War efforts. So in 1942, the U.S. decisive battle takes place in Midway, and eventually, a few months and another year or two later, the war in the South Pacific is safely in hand. So that efforts began to be shifted towards the European front. And if you remember, in 1944, the D-Day invasion of Normandy began, and that was pretty much the beginning of the end of the war. As the Allies gathered forces, as they were supported by the American efforts and by the other Allied efforts, the war certainly came to an end. And in 1945, Japan and Germany surrendered, and the rest is history. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is that there were people living in Germany, in particular in Berlin, who were God-fearing people who did not agree with the politics of the day, but who were forced to do things that they did not agree with. This morning, I'd like to introduce you to a family that grew up in Berlin in the late 1930s and early 1940s. I'd like to ask Dave and Ursie to please come up to the front. Come on up here. Let's bring these out into the light. Thank you, Ursie, and thank you, Dave, for being willing to share your story with us here at Eagle Rock. This is an interesting picture of you and your family. This goes way back. When was that picture taken, Dave? Do you remember?
I see you.
I didn't ask you that before, did I?
About 1947.
1947. It's a beautiful picture. Now, David, you're a member of the Eagle Rock Church. How long have you been attending here?
It's been over 20 years now. I kind of came here accidentally when my old friend Conrad Litzchild asked me to join a group called the Eagle Rock Men's Chorus.
Eagle Rock Men's Chorus. I don't know the name.
There was no choir, but we were supposed to provide special music here once a month. So my membership actually was at the Glendale City Church at the time. And
you had to do something about that.
Men's chorus developed into a ministry. I was doing that for 22 years.
22 years.
I met my wife through the men's chorus. She was one of the volunteers who helped out.
What was the name of the men's chorus again?
I think it's called Christian Vision.
Oh, yes, I know that one. Yes. It became known as Christian over the years.
Right.
So you've been here for over 20 years now. Ursie, you're an Eagle Rock member, aren't you?
No, I'm not.
We'll have to do something about that.
I've been for years a member of Vallejo Drive Church. My sister and I actually opened up the youth chapel at Vallejo Drive when the church was built.
That's amazing. So you were both born in Berlin.
Yes, at the Adventist Hospital in Berlin.
At the Adventist Hospital. Now, David, we don't want to tell anyone your age, but what year were you born?
Well, I've had my 29th birthday many times. 1938.
1938. And as history will tell us, this
A year before the war started for Germany.
So the war began in 39, and you were a year old when all this happened. And of course, you grew up during the worst part of it there in Berlin. Ursie, he mentioned that there was an Adventist hospital in Berlin. Were there churches? What was Adventism like in Berlin in the early 40s?
Well, it was smaller churches, but there were a lot of churches, and our hospital was very well known. It was a beautiful, big hospital. My mother actually learned to be a nurse there.
So there was a good Adventist
So
community.
we were very close. We could walk to the hospital. We were very close to it.
And you mentioned that the field work, the office was there in Berlin for all of Germany for the Adventist Church.
And the conference
Conference.
office was also headquarters in
Yeah.
Berlin.
So it was kind of like a little Adventist Mecca.
It was a
Yeah.
union office.
Yeah, so after the war, the American people sent a lot of food items and clothing and shoes, and it all ended up in the General Conference.
You mean
In
through the Dorcas
in the
Society?
Berlin Conference, and then it was all distributed to various churches, so we would have some clothes and
Yeah, I can imagine that there are people here who remember those days and who may have contributed to the supplies that went over to Germany. So
Sorry it took us so long, but thank you very much.
now, what was obviously, Hitler was targeting a certain group of people. What was the impact to Seventh-day Adventists in early 1940s?
Well, Hitler and the people that supported him in his quests basically treated him like the savior for the German people because they were punished for whatever happened at World War I. And Hitler was the leader who kind of brought the spirit of nationalism back
Yes.
and respect for German people, and so the supporters, they kind of tried to elevate him to a God, a Messiah. We, as Adventists, of course, knew better, but we could not publicly disagree with those thoughts. So for Germans, Adventism was hard to practice. School operated 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday.
you couldn't
Because
really
we
do
kept-
missionary work either because of the Sabbath, the seventh day, and so we wouldn't be mistaken as Jewish people and be taken to concentration camps.
Hitler didn't like Jews very well, obviously.
Yes.
Because of the fact that Adventists observed the Sabbath, we were often mistaken as being Jews, and probably would have been assigned to the same fate had.
Yes. So there was a real danger that worshiping on Sabbath could have equated you with the hatred for the Jews by the leadership of the German government.
So even though we had 20 small churches or more in Berlin, and Adventist presence through the hospital, etc., even towards the end, there were meetings taking place in homes rather than in our various chapels throughout the city, just because of the danger of meeting on Sabbath.
So all the Seventh-day Adventist churches there were basically vacant on Sabbath, but people were meeting in homes.
Right.
And you were mentioning, Ursie, that your home was one of these homes that church services were held.
Yeah. My mother, we had Bible studies in our home and we
Yeah.
had the church service in our home.
My grandfather was the head elder of our
Oh,
church.
he was the head elder.
And so obviously the family supported him very much.
Yes. So the church, it's amazing to me that the Adventist church was alive and well during some of these really, really dark times. Your father was a very, very interesting person. Tell us about his occupation and how he was involved in the war inadvertently.
Her dad was actually a painter, a house painter by trade. But in those days, there wasn't much effort as trying to control harmful substances in paint. So my dad eventually succumbed to lead poisoning and never gave up his career. But one of the things he had a liking for was driving cars and fixing them. So he early on got himself a driver's license, which was a major accomplishment in the German society, and used it as an opportunity to change careers. He became a chauffeur for the German Red Cross.
Oh, so he worked for the Red Cross.
Worked with the Red Cross and actually was the chauffeur for the president of the Red Cross and vice next level down, basically the executive team.
Okay. And so what happened to the Red Cross when the war began? Or as the war progressed?
The Red Cross was an independent agency at first, but all of a sudden one day Hitler signed a decree that merged the German Red Cross into the German Army. So overnight, my dad became soldier, wearing his Red Cross uniform.
Yes.
And then, of course, was subject to whatever assignments the Army made for. And he continued to be the chauffeur for the Red Cross personnel,
Yes.
but found himself traveling outside the city over into Paris and other areas, depending on where the German Army went.
So he went to the Western Front, traveling with the troops. Now, you mentioned to me he was a conscientious objector.
Well, yes, in Germany, of course, there was no category like that. So if you were anywhere near the age in which you could be drafted into the Army, you became a first aids corpsman through the Red Cross to try to stay out of combat.
Yes.
And so that was one of the things my dad did as well. Besides driving the car, he became first aidsman.
Yes.
And that, of course, then put him into the troops as they got relocated.
Yeah. Now, obviously, life in Berlin during the war was very difficult. All these pictures, and during our children's story, we saw these amazing pictures of these planes coming in. But before that time, planes were coming in to do what?
To bomb us. To damage our lives.
Now, they only came to bomb like the military buildings, right? They wouldn't.
No,
the neighborhoods.
bombed everything, everywhere, day and night bombing.
Well, remember, we didn't have...
Schools were closed, no more, because it was too dangerous to go to school. And it was really very upsetting for me, especially.
The bombing rates kept intensifying. And of course, in those days, technology was not what it is today. There were no such things as precision bombs. So bombs were just dropped in areas where they thought were military installations or things that were necessary to sustain life in the city. Those things were targets. But a lot of bombs went astray, and one of them went astray and
Wow.
hit a building. So
One of the bombs hit your building?
yes, we of course we were warned through the civil defense agencies, through sirens, when bombing rates were approaching, and so we had to get up middle of the night, sleepy as we were, and go down to the cellar, which was supposed to be the safest place, and this happened night after night. And then, of course, one night, the men in the building, they all suddenly disappeared. And we found out actually later that one of those small bombs had hit our building, but it came down in the stairwell of the building. It was a 3-story apartment building. And in preparation for these kinds of events, the Germans had arranged for buckets of water and bags of sand to be stored at the landings of all these buildings.
The bombs were supposed to cause fires. And
Right,
burn the
they were
building.
incendiary bombs. And this one started a fire, but it kind of came down on the stairwell side of the wall. In retrospect, had the bomb moved over about 6 to 9 inches, it would have ended up in my bedroom. And it would not have not been discovered until it had done its damage. So in this way, God protected us from any consequences, really, because there was not even much physical damage, just a hole in the roof where the bomb came through.
It came very, very close to your bedroom. That's amazing. Well, before we, well, let's not. I'm showing you a picture of is this a hospital? Can you tell us?
It's a hospital, it's not the Adventist hospital.
It's not the Adventist hospital. Okay, my bad. Okay, what was I thinking? Well, why did you go to this hospital?
That's actually a military hospital.
Oh, it's a military hospital.
Where wounded soldiers were sent for treatment and recuperation. My dad was hit with shrapnel during his service on the Western Front. And I believe it was the Western Front. Might have been the Eastern Front, but he was injured. He was sent here for recuperation. It was in southern Germany. And my mother took my younger sister and I down to visit him. DaveUrsie was already living with relatives.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah. But we all went down to see my dad here for his recuperation, and while we were gone, we received news through my grandfather that the apartment building we were living in Berlin had been hit by a bomb and was completely destroyed. It was a 3 or 4 story building that also was completely destroyed, nothing left.
So I imagine that when your mother received the news that your father was injured and that he was hospitalized, that must have been very bad news. But what you're telling me is that when she got to the hospital, because you had to go visit him, when the bombs came down and destroyed your building, you weren't there at the time.
We weren't there. Our lives were spared. Obviously, our neighbors were not.
Wow.
Material things, of course, were gone, but we still thank God for it.
You see God's hand
Yes.
taking care of you there.
Yes.
Absolutely. This is a really cute picture of our friend DaveUrsie here. Can you tell which one DaveUrsie is?
The oldest.
The happy, smiliest one is what I would say. DaveUrsie, this is when the picture of your family together, but you weren't always together. Tell us about that.
No. In 1943, I was about 7 years old. My mom sent me to my relatives in the mountains because I was terrified of the heavy-duty bombing. And we had a relative come and visit us in Berlin, and she could not believe what she experienced within 1 week time. And she says, since the schools are closed and DaveUrsie is afraid of the bombing and everything, why don't you send her to us? And that was in the mountains near the Czechoslovakian border, which today is Czechoslovakia, but at that time it was Germany. And there was no bombing there, and the schools went on. And I was also at the age where I would have had to deal with the Hitler Youth program, which we would not want to have a part of, but Hitler pushed it a lot, and a lot of kids lost contact with their parents at that time.
Wow.
So I was away from home for about 3 years.
3 years. So
3
during
years.
the worst part of the war, you were away.
Yeah, but we experienced the after effects of the war. When the war ended, the Russians came through, then the Czechoslovakians took over.
Right.
And they kicked us out of our homes. And we were 3 families living in 1 room, and us kids slept up in the attic. And we had ropes up down the window where we could maybe take off and escape in case of danger.
Wow, very good.
So there were definitely some sad experiences, but when we were kicked out of our home, one of my aunts was already put into a concentration camp, and I asked my aunt if I could go with that aunt and hopefully get back to my parents. Because we had no contact, no correspondence. I did not know if my parents were still alive, if they were bombed. We had no knowledge.
I can't imagine the uncertainty of
So,
not knowing
My
that.
aunt that must have been very hard because my mother committed me to that aunt
Right.
and we didn't know where we were going, what the Czechoslovakians would do with us.
Yeah.
So I went with my aunt and was in concentration camp for 3 months. And we were put in boxcars and shipped out. We didn't know. I was in a boxcar for 2 weeks, day and night, pitch dark, no seats in there, just our luggage. And we had a pair.
Wait, did you say you're in a concentration camp?
Mhm.
I'm sorry, I was stuck on that. But
Yeah.
are you talking about like
Yeah, I mean,
barracks
we
and
had
barbed wire?
wired fences, we had stacked, 3 beds on top, like if you see the Hiding Place movie, it kind of gives you an idea.
Wow.
And straw mattresses full of bugs, and
For a young girl to be experiencing that, I can't imagine. And so you're saying then they placed you in boxcars on a train to go
Yeah.
where?
we didn't know where we were going. We were just sent at 5 o'clock in the morning to get on the train. There were about 40 or 50 boxcars, I don't remember, and in each boxcar were 50 people, just women and
15 or
children.
50?
50.
50.
So you figure how tight with the luggage and everything, how that was. And we were on in that boxcar for 2 weeks. It was just a little window where we could maybe look once in a while to see where we were going.
For 2 weeks
And
inside?
they opened up the boxcar every night to empty the pail because we had to go potty in front of everybody. And then people had also died and they kicked those to the side when the train went on. And after a week we had a train accident. We had a collision with another train. And the first 10 boxcars were completely demolished.
Wow.
And I was in boxcar number 15, so the power was strong, but I was alive. And then they divided the train up for half of the train went to the West Germany and the other half of the train went to East Germany. And I ended up in East Germany. So it was very difficult to connect with Berlin
Yes.
and find my relatives or parents if they were alive or something like that.
Right.
So East Germany actually is, the communist side. So communists, of course, tried to purposely to disconnect any kind of communication between the East and West side. And the rest of us were in what later became West Berlin. The American, French, and British occupation zones were formed together, combined together to form West Berlin. And no contact allowed there with the East side. So my experience was watching my mother always trying to find out where my sister was.
Yeah, I could
There was
imagine.
no connection.
No communication, not knowing. I mean, you didn't know if they were alive. They didn't
No.
know if you were alive or where
No,
you were.
because Berlin was one of the heaviest bombed cities.
Yes.
So you did not know, and then you just had no
The
idea.
whole geography changed, I'm sure. Fascinating story. Your father had a book written about him,
That's right.
and it was called The Seventh Escape, because he was captured by the Russians. Can you walk us through that? How did that happen?
Actually, my dad was, his unit was transferred from what we call the Western Front, meaning France, to relocated to the Eastern Front meaning Russia and the area around Stalingrad. And you know, there were big battles there. My dad saw an opportunity when that transfer order came through to make a detour and visit his family in Berlin. The official route did not include Berlin, but he found a way to come and see us in Berlin.
Yeah.
And of course, he had to get his stamp in his travel papers along the way, and there were time limits on that, so it was a very calculated effort.
Yeah.
But he saw us in Berlin for maybe a day or so, and then he moved on by train to catch up with his unit. He arrived at all of the inspection stations on time, got his entries approved and all that. And when this train arrived in Romania, Romania had changed its allegiance from Germany to the Russian side. So as they welcomed the train, all the Germans that were on that train, which was mostly military personnel, of course, they were all taken prisoner by the Romanians.
So the Romanians, before he left, the Romanians were on the German side. By the time he got there,
Yes,
they were with the Russians.
right.
And so he was taken prisoner.
And so, in fact, I still remember my dad saying that the Romanians that took them captive actually were very friendly because they still kind of identified with the German side. But they were now obligated to take orders from the Russian side, and so their orders were to hold these people and then turn them over to the Russians.
And is that when he was sent to
So
Russia?
he got sent to deep into Russia. Yes.
Okay. This map shows from left to right, all the way from the left. I don't know if you can read that. It's Berlin, and he was taken by train all the way to the right, deep into Russia, near Makeyevka. How many miles is that from home?
Okay, it's about 1,500 miles.
13 miles from home. Okay. And so we won't get into it because we would love for everyone to read the book, but basically he begins a series of escapes.
7 of them.
Right.
How many?
7.
He escaped 7 times?
That's what it turned out to be, Danny. We didn't know this at the time the manuscript was actually prepared. And
Well, tell us about how, obviously it's an amazing story, we'll let everybody read it, but years later you come back to the States and there was no book written. How did his story become book?
Well, actually, as kids, of course, everybody wanted my dad to tell the story. And he kept telling it, but I noticed that the more often he told it, the little details would change. And so while I was in college at Andrews University, I thought, well, when I graduate and don't have to do any more studying, I'm going to write my dad's story down black and white, so it will never change.
So the details won't change.
And, I graduated and I discovered that I'm not a journalist. So I happened to mention this once in a social setting with friends in Loma Linda. And at this event, there happened to be Jan and Lonnie Doward. And that's the first time we met the couple. And something
Jan was an author.
I found out he was an author. I happened to make that comment as I just pointed out a few things about that story to Lonnie Doward, his wife, that I really wanted to write this in a book, but I'm not a journalist, I'm not a writer. And she says, oh, but my husband is. And so we got his attention, and he said,
That's the first time that Jan
yes,
began to think about writing.
and he said, if your dad would release his story to me, he says, I already know the title of the book. So he told us, Seventh Escape. And I said, well, why did you pick that? Well, 7 is the perfect number in the Bible, and escape will get everybody's attention. So when we got all done with the manuscript, it It was started in German, obviously. Dad's English was not that great. And then I would translate it into English, and Jan, of course, would polish it up and do his own research and historical facts. But we then sat down and added up all the escapes, and guess what? There were actually 7 escapes.
Wow.
So I kind of feel like the Lord had a hand in, that this book should be called.
Wow. But when Jan first heard about the story, he didn't know how many escaped.
No, we just knew there were 7.
Wow, that's amazing. And who would have known?
7 escapes in 9 months' time.
7 escapes in 9 months. So it took him 9 months to get
Right.
back to his family.
And he was 98 pounds when he came back to Berlin.
98.
He arrived in October 45.
You know, there's so many amazing details, but they're going to have to read the book if they want to hear what those are.
But the interesting thing is too that he connected with a nurse at the beginning in Russia.
Okay, so he was all the way in Russia.
Yeah, and somehow they were able to meet up with another friend, 3 of them, meet up in Berlin after the war. And my dad found out that this nurse was punished because they thought that she helped him escape. And she was put in water for a whole week,
To stand in water.
standing water,
Up to.
all day long for a whole week, damaged her body and everything. She almost died.
Wow.
And yet she had nothing to do with helping my father. He did that always on his own.
He gets into trouble by himself, right?
But the most fascinating, interesting thing is when the book was printed originally in 1969, my father was so proud and everything, so he had joined the Berliner Club in Detroit, Michigan, and talked about the book. And then one of the guys says, "Why don't you talk about it the next meeting?" And so he was happy. He talked about it, and afterwards, a gentleman comes up to him and says, "Walter, I want you to come to my house for dinner. I want you to meet my wife. She was in Russia, and she would love everybody have a lot in common." And so my mom and dad went over there for dinner, and it was that very nurse. So from Russia to Berlin, and out of all places, they met up again in Detroit, Michigan. And they became very close friends, and she was at my dad's funeral.
Wow.
And
That's amazing.
that is just truly a fascinating story.
Absolutely it is. And your dad lived to be how old?
90.
90?
90 and a half.
Wow.
Makes sense.
I think if September 11 would have happened, they would have lived longer. That shook him up. That shook him up.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, to make long story short, it took him 9 months this is after the war, of course. It took him 9 months to get back home. I'm sure you had no
Well,
idea.
the war was still going on when he actually started to escape.
Okay.
So, the war ended in May of that year. So, and he arrived in Berlin in October.
So did you have any idea where he was or whether he was alive or
Didn't hear anything.
until you saw him?
Right.
Do you remember the first day you saw him?
Oh, yes.
What was that
Because this was after the war, of course, and we were again having our church services in our chapels, as we call them. But there was no heat, and so we all volunteered in the congregation, those who could, to go out in the woods and gather up whatever twigs or pine needles, anything that would burn that we could put into the oven and pass them home for church service. We were doing that when the news came that my dad had come back. And so my mother left, somebody took her down to my grandfather's shoe store. And we didn't know more about it until we had come home and we saw my grandfather very skinny man in a very sloppy-looking outfit coming down the street, way down the way from us, moving very, very slowly.
Wow.
And
You saw your dad again.
couldn't forget it, even though he lost a lot of weight. But it was definitely time for rejoicing, and actually, because my dad, his love for cars, was able to again land a chauffeur job.
Wow.
This time it was for the radio station that was operated by the American Information Agency in West Berlin.
Yeah.
And that helped with them, my parents, to get me out of the Russians.
Okay, so he came back, and then at that point, they started to look for you. And I know you told me there was paperwork and all kinds of things, but his job helped.
The officials at the radio station helped very much with the paperwork and locating and connecting and
Yeah.
You know, you also mentioned that after the war, there were this airlift that was taking place.
yeah, called the Berlin Airlift. Started in 1948. The Russian troops, of course, had occupied all of Germany in the eastern half, or a third, I would say. So Berlin was right in the middle of all of this. And we were dependent on supplies coming in by rail and highways and rivers and barges. So, the Russians decided one day to stop playing the game. They wouldn't let anything through. And fortunately for us living in Berlin, what we call the Allies, American, French, and British, chose to actually supply everything by air. Everything. There was one major airport, the primary airport in Berlin, you might call it today Berlin International Airport, but it was Tempelhof Field. And that's where this picture was taken. It was surrounded by big apartment buildings before the war, but this is what it looked like afterwards. And so these planes came in about every 3 minutes to supply the population in Berlin with the necessities of life.
Yeah. And there
No
was
luxuries, just necessities.
And there was this photo actually made it into an issue of Life in 1948.
Yes. Yes.
And tell us who's in the picture.
Not me.
Not you? But you were there.
I was there. I didn't want to climb up on the ruins.
But here, circled in red, we see a picture of...
Myself and my younger sister.
Wow. So an Eagle Rock Church member made it into life. What an incredible and amazing story. As you reflect in closing now upon the way that God led you and life, was there ever any question that God's will was prevailing in your life? Whether at that time or when you moved back into transition to America?
We've had so many instances, Danny, which we saw God's leading hand, protecting hand. There's no doubt in my mind that God is alive and that He cares about each one of us every day. We may not give Him enough attention to realize just how much He's watching over us. But as I reflect on all these events and even continuing as we started anew in Michigan and wherever life has taken us since, there have been so many events where I said, God was there.
Ursie,
Yes,
God's watching out for you, isn't He?
I hope so.
You have an amazing story as well, and to me it speaks about God's faithfulness in your life. And Ursie, I gotta say this, you're dealing with some health issues right now, and it's still a bit uncertain as to how to treat it and what it is. God has you in the palm of His hand, and He's going to continue.
He's always been there for me. So whatever is to be will be, I guess. I just have to deal with it.
He's got you in the palm of his hand and he's watching out. David, same thing for you. You've been really, really blessed. And I just wanted to thank you for being willing to share this story with us because it reminds us about what a good God we have. Amen. I'll end by reading Psalm 91. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Surely He will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only observe with your eyes and see the punishment of the wicked, and you will say, the Lord is my refuge, and you make the Most High your dwelling. No harm will overtake you, no disaster will come near your tent. For He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up on their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the cobra, you will trample the great lion and the serpent. Because He loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue Him, I will protect Him, for He acknowledges my name. He will call on me, I will answer Him, I will be with Him in trouble. I will deliver Him and honor Him. With long life I will satisfy Him and show Him my salvation. Let's pray together.